And now, please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to Les Misérables. 150 million people in 52 countries, in 22 languages, have made Les Misérables the most beloved musical in the world. You've had the opportunity of seeing a 10th anniversary celebration that was done in an amphitheater and made into a brilliant film. Same thing is true with the 25th anniversary. And now, of course, we have a brilliant Hollywood version of Les Misérables. It has been realized in almost every major art form. It's an extraordinary work. Okay, well, let us go to the beginning and see how all this started. Of course, we have to begin then with the author, Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo was born in 1802 in Paris, and he died in 1885. He probably was the most beloved Frenchman of the century. He was a great artist and a great statesman. As an artist, he would write 2 volumes of extraordinary poetry. Musicians would take that poetry and create over 1,000 different musical pieces based on the poetry. He was a brilliant playwright. He would write a play called Hernani, which incidentally was turned into a magnificent opera by Verdi. I want you to remember there are over 100 operas based on Victor Hugo's works. But in the case of Hernani, it was such a controversial production that there were literally fistfights in the theater. I do not recommend this, but in any case, it happened because it was opposed. Victor Hugo stood up to a movement that was happening in France that had dominated the theater for almost 80 years, and it was the idea of neoclassicism, where everything had to be presented in the way the great ancient Greeks did. But this was very limiting in terms of storytelling. And finally, it made the theater too predictable and too much based on a formula. Same thing was true in poetry. And so Victor Hugo stood up and said, no, enough. And with Hernani, he would create a whole new style of theater, which he would write a long essay and name it Romanticism, with the idea that there was a vast, sweeping, episodic story with very strong political backgrounds, with a focus on a brilliant love story, many plots and subplots. This is very much the kind of formula that Shakespeare used in the 1600s when he wrote. But Victor Hugo would name this style, and it would become our most dominant style right down to this day. Keep in mind, most of our movies, most of our television shows, most of our novels are written in this sort of vast, sweeping, episodic way that Victor Hugo outlined for us in the case of Hernani. He would also write a brilliant book in 1829 called The Last Day in the Life of a Condemned Man. This is very important because it really is the basis for Les Misérables. Victor Hugo was very opposed to capital punishment. Keep in mind, he's very far ahead of his time. This is 1829, remember. And also, he was very opposed to all of the draconian laws that damaged and hurt, especially the poor people of Paris. So Victor Hugo was always very mindful of the underclass, even though he lived in a very privileged way himself and was the greatest artist of his day. He would write a large number of extraordinary novels. We know primarily 2 of his novels, Les Misérables, of course, but then beyond that we know The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And aside from loving Quasimodo and Esmeralda in that story, we also fall in love with actually the cathedral itself, Notre Dame. He writes about it in such a compelling way in this stunning romantic novel that we just feel obligated to put the book down and go to Paris and celebrate Notre Dame. And that's exactly what people did in the 1830s. People from all over Europe and literally all over the world flocked to Paris to make pilgrimages at Notre Dame. The French were very embarrassed because they had not put any money in Notre Dame in hundreds of years. And so the end result was they very quickly had to restore it to its magnificence. So Victor Hugo has played such an important part in the entire tapestry of France. Something I want you to know about what was going on politically. We remember, of course, that the French Revolution happened in 1789, and it was over in 1795. It was a brutal bloodbath. Louis XVI, that is Louis XIV, was executed, as was Marie Antoinette, and over 600 aristocrats were given one-way tickets to the guillotine, so it was a very brutal time. But unlike America, we had our revolution in 4 years, but the French didn't stop there. There would ultimately be 3 French revolutions, 2 of them in Victor Hugo's lifetime. So Victor Hugo was born in 1802, as I told you, so Napoleon would come to power in that period and name himself the emperor. And so Napoleon ruled with an iron fist in this period. He was overthrown by Louis XVIII, who in turn was overthrown by Napoleon, and Napoleon would finally lose the Battle of Waterloo and would go into exile and live in the island of St. Helena, which is off the coast of South Africa. I had the great privilege of visiting that remote and desolate and mystical island 3 times. It's an extraordinary place. So Napoleon now is out of the picture. Charles X comes to power, and then finally he is overthrown by Louis Napoleon. And Victor Hugo, by this point, the time is 1850, Victor Hugo has gone through all, as the French people have, all this tremendous upheaval of going from a monarchy to being independent, to being in a monarchy, etc. And so Victor Hugo was so opposed to Louis Napoleon taking over that he wrote this massive work called Napoleon Le Petit. And it was a very insulting, calling Napoleon the little Napoleon was very insulting to Napoleon III, and he wanted to have Victor Hugo beheaded. So Victor Hugo had to quickly slip out of France and live in exile for 20 years in those Channel Islands between France and England. He lived in Guernsey for literally 20 years, and it's where he would write Les Misérables. After Louis Napoleon fell, and we had the Third Republic, which meant the independence of France, Victor Hugo returned and ended his life triumphantly there. When he died, there were 2 million people in a cortege that marched from the Arc de Triomphe to the Pantheon, where he was given a poet's funeral. So an extraordinary life, giving gifts to the French people on so many levels and to the rest of the world. Now, to look specifically at the creation of the novel, Victor Hugo literally saw an event that would trigger the writing of this book. As you know, those of you who have seen it, that we're introduced to young students near the end of the first act of the story, and they are there to protect the poor people of Paris. Victor Hugo would call them les misérables, the miserable ones. And so they decided to stand up for the poor people because at a particular date in 1832, we had an uprising. And it was based on the students trying to protect the poor. And what you'll hear in the story when you watch the musical tonight, near the end of the first act, when you meet the students, someone will come in and say, General Lamarck is dead. It's only one line, but it's a pivotal reason for why the students then stood up for the poor, because General Lamarck was the only person in the government who really looked after the rights of the poor. And keep in mind, we're talking about abject poverty, people living in the streets in the most deplorable situations, without food, without shelter. It was a very difficult time. At the time, in 1832, there was also a cholera epidemic that was besieging, of course, the poor. They had the worst sanitation and the worst hygiene, and so, of course, they suffered the most in this process. So the only people to protect them were the students. And what would happen in 1832 in that summer is they would set up a barricade in the streets. That's what the French always do. So, they stop traffic and people can't move freely through the city. And so they sent a group of soldiers who were representing the monarchy. They were perfectly trained, they had ammunition, and were highly prepared for this battle. And then, of course, there were the students who had gathered together a few guns, and the only way they could create the barricade was by throwing furniture out of windows to fall in the street, where they would then create a sort of barricade. And of course, the students were slaughtered in this horrific confrontation that would happen on that summer day. In real life, Victor Hugo was in the Tuileries, those magnificent gardens, and he started seeing the militia start marching, and so he ran ahead only to be stopped by the barricade. So Victor Hugo literally stood in a doorway and watched this battle happen, where the militia would destroy the students. And that is, of course, the high point and the culmination of this whole very powerful story. Okay, so in any case, Victor Hugo then had several other incidents that would impact his reason to write Les Misérables. He was in the park one day, this time the Bois de Boulogne, and he saw a policeman brutally beat a poor, starving man who had stolen a loaf of bread for his family. Not only was the poor man beaten, but he was incarcerated for many years. And this was obsessive with Victor Hugo. He would base his primary protagonist in this brilliant story we're going to see, Jean Valjean. We see Jean Valjean at the opening of the show when he's released after 19 years of hard labor, in this case for stealing a loaf of bread for his sister's starving children. We also meet in that opening moment Javert, who is the policeman who has made this poor man's life miserable for 19 years. And right at the top of the story, Jean Valjean is told that even though he is now paroled, he will have to report to Javert for the rest of his life. And this is something that Jean Valjean can't do, so he breaks parole and runs away. And that will be the basis of this story that we see, that begins in 1815 and ends in 1832. It is Jean Valjean being pursued by his captor. And it's a very compelling story, and they're given brilliant music, and we get so involved in the telling of this story. Another event that Victor Hugo would witness, again in another park at a similar period of time, is he saw this poor woman and her sort of bedraggled child, and again the police were assaulting her, telling the woman that they were going to take the child away from her because she couldn't properly take care of the child. And of course, there is nothing more powerful than a mother's love. And so it was a scene that became indelible in Victor Hugo's mind. He would create the brilliant female character, Fantine, that we meet at the beginning of the show, as the remembrance of that poor mother who is trying to protect her child. And then he would create one of the most memorable children in literature, Cosette. As you know, that image of Cosette, this drawing of Cosette, was put in the original book version of Les Misérables, and it's become one of the most famous literary illustrations in the world. In the first moment we meet Cosette in the musical, we see her looking exactly like that with her little broom And it brings goosepimples to you every time. I've seen the show countless times, but it brings goosepimples to you. And then she sings that compelling song at the beginning of the story. So in any case, what you know is that Victor Hugo uses life to create his stories. Remember, Charles Dickens, who lived in England and was his contemporary, did exactly the same thing. Charles Dickens would walk the streets of London every night to be connected to the people of the streets. And in the same way, Victor Hugo in Paris was doing exactly the same thing. Okay, so we know that Victor Hugo is in exile for offending Louis Napoleon, and he will spend 17 years writing Les Misérables, which is his masterpiece. It's one of the great novels ever written. I mean, keep in mind, he's in competition with Dostoevsky, all the great Russian writers of the day, all the great English writers of the day, but it is Victor Hugo who remains supreme for the brilliance of his use of language and storytelling. Okay, so the time now is 1862. Victor Hugo has finished the book after 17 years. He's still in exile, and he's wanting to publish it. Let me just pause and tell you something about the novel. The novel is 2,786 pages. Over the last break, I had cataract surgery, and I went to my doctor after, and he said, "Of course, you're not planning on doing any reading." And I said, "Oh, no, doctor, I'm just reading Les Misérables," hoping he wouldn't have read it, but unfortunately he had. And he said to me, "Well, at least read the large print." And I said, "Well, then the book will be 5,000 pages long." So in any case, I defied the doctor. I read the book. My surgery turned out perfectly. You're more beautiful than I remembered, and that's that. Okay, so here we are. We're back in the story. So we know it's this huge novel. Victor Hugo wrote it in 5 volumes. The reason he wrote it, and we see the story, the first 3 volumes are in the first act, the second 2 volumes are in the second act. But in any case, the reason they wrote in that way, in that sort of serialized way, it was very popular in the 19th century to sell the novel in segments. So volume 1 would be released, everyone would read it all, it'd be translated, people would read it all over the world, and then we'd wait for volume 2. And then finally, everyone waited for the production of the book with the brilliant illustrations, etc. And that would happen in 1862. Okay, in any case, Victor Hugo loved to spend money. He lived very palatially. But in terms of little things, he was very parsimonious. And so he was dying to know what happened to his novel, but he's in exile. So he decides to send a cable, grumbling how expensive cables are. So he decided to send only one symbol to his publisher. It was a question mark. The publisher answered it with one symbol, an exclamation point. So, of course, this was one of the great literary understatements ever, because it was one of the most brilliantly received novels ever, as it still is right to the present. Okay, so now how do we have this brilliant musical being created out of this massive novel? So let me introduce Alain Boublil and Claude-Michel Schönberg, the composer, lyricists of this really magnificent and perfect opera. They both worked in Paris in the 1970s as songwriters. Now, do remember, we had great songwriters, pop writers in that period, Charles Aznavour, Jacques Brel, Edith Piaf. It's in that style of these very anthem-like songs. So they were making very good living as pop music writers. However, their real love was a musical theater. Keep in mind, France has never embraced the Broadway musical theater or the West End musical theater. In fact, the French have really only liked 2 musicals. They've loved Godspell and they've loved West Side Story, but that's it. Okay, so our 2 heroes now are desperate to want to have a life in the musical theater, but there is no venue for it. And of course, they speak French and write their music in French, so they have a very limited venue. In any case, Alain Boublil, the lyricist, would go to London in the early 1970s and saw a brilliant production, of course, of Jesus Christ Superstar. And he came back overwhelmed with the idea of this new style of musical theater that is really an opera, a story that is totally sung. And he was so compelled by the story that the two men would write their own rock opera, and it was called The French Revolution, the Révolution Française. And in any case, that was released, but to very limited appeal. They played it in an outdoor amphitheater for several months. It was very successful. They did a concept album. It sold very well, but that was it. There was no further way of distributing it. And that was sort of their contribution to the musical theater. Even though this is a beautiful work, it's never been translated, incidentally, into English. Okay, so the next thing that would happen, several years later, Alain Boublil would go back to London where he would see a revival of Oliver. And it was produced by Cameron Mackintosh. And it was wonderfully presented, and he was again blown away by it. He went back several nights to see it over and over again. And when he came back to Paris, he said, I was so struck of the parallels between Oliver and Les Misérables. And that, you know, the child in Oliver, the artful dodger, is very like the brilliant urchin that we fall in love with, one of the great urchins of the musical theater, Gavroche, and we fall in love with him as a little child and as one of the major storytellers in this brilliant, extraordinary epic tale that we're going to see. So they decide to tackle Les Misérables, all 2,876 pages of it. And I want to remind you of something. When I read the book, and I had read it many times, but not just before I'd seen the production, in the novel, over a fourth of the novel, we have sort of long digressions where Victor Hugo will talk about, for example, the sewers of Paris. Well, we remember when we see the show that the sewers of Paris play a very important part in the second act of the story. But he gives you so much atmosphere in the way he writes about them. And then he will write about the orphan children of the street urchins, and he'll go on for 50 pages about it. And then we see these brilliant children in the story as the story unfolds. So it always connects to the story. It's always adding atmosphere to the story, but there are these long digressions. He writes about being anti-monarchist. He writes about argot, which is street slang. So it's loaded with all of this sort of philosophic detail in the novel. You're never bored by it because he's such a brilliant writer. You're compelled, and it keeps adding to the atmosphere of the story. But what struck me when I saw this musical version, you remember now, you're seeing a groundbreaking version of this show. This is the new version that was put together. It opened here in Cleveland. Its world premiere was here. Cameron Mackintosh, the composer and lyricist, were all here for a week, working very seriously on giving you an absolutely brilliant and vital and energized production of this magnificent work. So you're really seeing a rebirth of a great classic. So, and the other thing I want you to know about that nobody's really written about, in Victor Hugo's lifetime, he painted over 4,000 paintings. He never showed them publicly, even though he was a first-class artist and would have been considered one of the great visual artists of the century. And he was painting in sort of abstract expressionism. But he didn't want to be in competition with himself, so the paintings were never really publicly displayed. Well, you have a wonderful opportunity of seeing many of these paintings as backdrops on the sets that you'll be seeing. And they are the actual paintings that Victor Hugo drew, so they add tremendous atmosphere to the telling of the story that you're going to see. Okay, so in any case, these men make another major decision in the creation of their musical. They realize how dark the tale is. And they realize that in all great storytelling, you've got to find a way of balance. If everything is only dark, 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 it's very hard to have any relief. And so they were looking for comic relief. And they, were influenced by what happens in Oliver, where there are a lot of comic barroom scenes. So they would use the tavern as sort of a basis, but on a much more important literary influence, they would go to Shakespeare. And keep in mind, Shakespeare, especially in his history plays, for example, Henry V, Falstaff takes Prince Hal to a bar, they get drunk, it's a very funny comic scene before we move into all of the darkness of Henry V. So Shakespeare understood the value of wenches in taverns. And so our two men will take that same lead, and you will see two of the great comic characters in the modern musical, and that will be the innkeeper and his wife. They are so completely despicable. I mean, we love to hate them, and the more obnoxious they are, the more we love them. This is all in the style of Shakespeare and wonderfully done, and great comic relief for the telling of this massive tale. And they will link through all of the stories, and we will follow them from the very beginning of the tale when we meet them with the child Cosette, and all the way up to the end of the story. Okay, so they will present their show in 1980. So they've written this masterpiece. Keep in mind, the great composer, the opera composer Puccini, loved Les Misérables, and he spent 2 years at the height of his success, stopping all his other work and working for 2 years on trying to create an opera of Les Misérables. At the end, he threw his hands up and said, "It's brilliant, only in the form it was written, the novel. I can't find any way of reducing it for opera." And so in any case, our men, on the other hand, were able to do it, and they've done it with great distinction. The major stories, the major themes, the major characters are all brilliantly realized in this version of Les Misérables you're going to be seeing. Okay, so they opened the show in 1980. Again, no major venue in Paris, so they go back to the Palais des Sports, this big outdoor 4,500-seat amphitheater, and they were lucky enough to be able to, there was an open slot. At one end of the story was the Moscow Circus. At the other end of the story was Holiday on Ice, so you can see the kind of popular entertainment that happened there. In the middle, they were going to present a new ballet by Nureyev, and it was going to go on a world tour. But Nureyev was stricken, sadly, tragically, with AIDS, and the project was canceled. So there was this open spot, and so Les Misérables was put in that spot. Luckily, the composer and lyricist found a brilliant French director, Robert Hossein. I watched many of his works doing all the great French classics. He was a very important, serious director in France. So he would do this spectacular production of Les Misérables in French. It was 2.5 hours long. They played it in the outdoor amphitheater, packed for 3 months, and they did a concept album which sold 500,000 copies. My partner, David Fraser, and I were in Paris in that period in 1980. We were working with Chapel Music on music of Jacques Brel. And the Chapel Music said to us, "We have a couple tickets. Are you interested in seeing this French opera?" And of course, we were thrilled to be able to get in to see it. And I did buy a concept album. I want you to know that of all the theater albums that have ever been done, that's the one that generates the most money by collectors. And so I said to myself, well, I'll save this for my dotage and sell it. And I realized recently that I'm in my dotage, so I've decided not to sell it. I'm giving it to Playhouse Square. Okay, so in any case, this is 1980. It stops dead in the water. The project's over. There's nowhere else to present it. 3 years later, an English director will be in Paris. Friends will play the album for him, and he says, "This is monumental. I have to take it back to Cameron Mackintosh, the great British producer." And so he does. He borrows the album, pledging to return it, and he goes to Cameron Mackintosh and says, "Please listen to this, and I would like to direct this production in English." Cameron Mackintosh called him the next day, and he said, "Good news and bad news. The good news is I am going to produce it. The bad news is you're not going to direct it." But he said, "I'll give you a small finder's fee." And the young man said smartly, "No, why don't you give me a tiny fractional percentage of the royalty?" which he did. So you don't have to worry about that young man. He's living happily ever after. Okay, in any case, Cameron Mackintosh goes to Paris. You can imagine how surprised the composer and lyricist are. Nothing's happened to their work. It's been dead in the water for 3 years. The greatest producer in the world, keep in mind Cameron Mackintosh has just produced Cats, so he is the theater's fattest cat. He's made so much money, and he wants to spend it on a new production. And he tells the men there are 2 caveats to doing this project. One, they have to agree to stay connected with it through the whole life of the show. They obviously lived up to that because they were just in Cleveland 2 weeks ago. Great. The second caveat was that Cameron Mackintosh brilliantly said, you have to write a prologue because people in the English-speaking world don't know the story of Les Misérables the way the French do. And so in that prologue, as we talked about, we are introduced to Jean Valjean, our protagonist, and Javert, the policeman who pursues him, and the whole story is so carefully set up. It adds 30 minutes to the story, but it's so worth it because it sets up the whole environment of the upheaval in France and the brilliant story that Victor Hugo is telling. So you're in for a great treat. Enjoy Les Misérables. Thank you.